So the topic today is DevOps liftoff with the rocket fuel of machine learning and QA. It's somewhat long-winded, but where it came about was I was trying to figure out, we've been in this DevOps space for a while. And we're trying to figure out like how to tie the thread of trends that are happening in DevOps, specifically with things like AI and machine learning. And this presentation attempts to sort of tie all of these together. So, one of the things we liken this to is in sort of May of 1961, President Kennedy announced that US would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, right? And accomplishing this feat required tremendous amount of focus, entirely new branches of studies that were invented, and insurmountable engineering challenges were tackled, right? And the pressure on these leaders at NASA must have been enormous. And I think of like engineering leaders today kind of face similar ambitious goals, right? We are asked to transform engineering teams, build products that will help companies face a new and ever-changing world, right? And in that world, what seems to have happened is there's this relentless pressure on engineering to deliver features fast, right? Speed is the mantra of the day. And everybody's trying to emulate unicorn companies and the desire to deliver features multiple times a day, if not thousands of times a day, right? And in this worldview, DevOps has been offered as the panacea to get engineering to deliver features fast and land these features in the hands of the customers. Now, this is all great. Everybody is going for speed, speed, speed. The flip side of this is this notion of churn. I was just talking to a industry stalwart investor a few weeks back who mentioned this, that churn is the affliction that's ailing software industry today. And that's, people are walking away because it has become acceptable to make customers our testers, and customers are walking away in hordes, right? And the perspective, I think rightly so, is there's no point in getting sales and marketing to work their ass off to get a customer in the door, only for them to walk away because of poor quality, right? And that's not good, right? And as engineering leaders, the relentless challenge to deliver software remains, right? And the way I think about this is, what engineering leaders are building is a rocket factory that can, launch more and more rockets, much at higher quality, really predictable, and really predictably, right? And building that rocket factory is hard. And DevOps is offered as the way to kind of do that. But with DevOps, the space is so wide and that engineering leaders face a staggering sort of array of choices. And you're essentially making a bet that is focused on technology, culture, and tying it all back to business value, right? So the argument that I make here is, in this talk, we look at the DevOps space. We look at how people sort of slice and dice it. And within that, slice and dice it, and we make the case that sort of the next phase in DevOps maturity is quality. And we finally look at sort of AI and see the impact that AI can have for development teams, right? This company itself, when it was started with the mantra of like smarter testing, faster DevOps. So no surprise that I'm actually going to lead down that way. So the agenda of the talk is, very quickly, we talk about engineering leadership challenges. We have a look at the DevOps landscape. We try to see how you can slice and dice this field. We look at the quality landscape. We look at the AI landscape. And then we spend a very short time looking at what Launchable can do. So if you look at sort of the challenges that engineering leaders face, I think the bigger one, sort of the philosophical and underlying fear, is, engineering leaders face the challenge on their credibility. And that happens because, they're not delivering software on time and at the right quality. And that's happening because, a part of your day, maybe, you are under this relentless stress of deadlines. There's one deadline after the other. You're landing new stuff out there. When stuff lands up, it's probably not the right quality, so it ends up having production, breakages or escalations. Somebody's trying to hack in your world. There's security sort of set of things you need to worry through. And when you try to sort of land new features, you end up in this world where there's these slow, long, and forced iterative feedback cycles, right? And then so you have like these hundreds of tests, and failures in these tests come back not in hours but in days. And so tests don't pass in a shot, and you're kind of iterating and going and trying to push these features out, right? Root cause analysis is hard, with hundreds of tests. We were just talking to one of the our customers, and it takes them about 6 sort of changes to get a change set through, right? And each change sort of takes like a few hours to a few days. So just to get a reasonable feature out, a developer has to sort of spend days kind of doing this, right? And that leads to unhappy developers, and unhappy developers leads to this place where the company faces attrition, right? There's another company that we are talking to is this is what they were saying, right? The SVP of engineering was saying this. So in their team, you have developers who are always sort of looking at the unicorn companies, and they see like the Googles of the world, which are able to amplify their developer sponge to 10x, right? While these folks in organizations are dealing with processes and tools from a generation ago. It's like you give them a laptop that's 10 years old and ask them to sort of build stuff today. That's just not going to work. So rightly so, in this worldview, DevOps comes in as this elite team that can rescue folks such that the rockets can fly off in time. But it goes beyond that analogy, and it talks about building that rocket yard factory that can actually ship rockets on time, right? So it's interesting. Let's just look at what DevOps actually means, right? It has in the last few years evolved to mean anything and everything, but there's like some specific definitions, and I'll just lean on some analyst definitions here, which defines DevOps as customer-driven, sort of customer value-driven approach. So really, customers upfront, and to deliver solutions using agile methods, collaboration, and automation. Right? There's a huge emphasis on people, culture, and collaboration between the dev operations and other stakeholders to deliver something of customer value. Right? Now, I personally like to think about this through the lens of Kaizen, right? This Japanese concept of continuous improvement. And the idea is you should have relentless focus on driving, improvements on these 3 vectors, right? Agile, collaboration, and automation. And more so, I think Agile's been around for a while, but more so, I think, in terms of automation and collaboration. Now, if you scratch sort of the surface and you walk into organizations, what we have found is that the culture piece takes an outsized bite in the DevOps transformation efforts, right? This team at Launchable has talked to hundreds, given our background, in Jenkins and Atlassian and so on, if not thousands of teams who are driving DevOps initiatives. And we often find that teams have spent months, if not years, driving cultural transformation, right? There is a diverse set of opinions on what's working in the DevOps way means, right? On one side of the spectrum is the highly simplistic, you just need one tool to do it all. Somewhere in the middle of the spectrum is this desire of bigger organizations to standardize on a set of tools. And on the extreme right-hand side is generally a whole sort of set of tools and processes that are in play, right? And so why do teams actually get stuck in these sort of cultural transformation efforts? One reason is this overwhelming number of tools, right? And actually, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? As you get into organizations, very quickly you realize that there exist hundreds, if not thousands, of software projects that exist at different differing levels of maturity, right? Each project has its own set of corresponding array of choices in terms of dev languages and their tech stacks and their process and culture, and way of doing things. It's really a diverse and not a homogeneous, world out there, right? So how do we sort of make sense of this world? Where should we start? What bets do we, end up taking? So one of the most popular things out there is, I just picked this image on DevOps from, some Google image. I couldn't find a source for it, but it is to look through, your entire SDLC cycle, software delivery life cycle, right, and determine sort of your DevOps tool chain. The logical approach here is to look at each of these phases. Analysts call it, create, verify, release, configure, or monitor, but you get the idea. You pick, each phase, you figure out where the biggest bang for the buck is, and then you focus on sort of improving and bringing in tooling around that and improving that, right? And so this DevOps tool chain is sort of the big part of sort of, driving this DevOps transformation. But what is happening, as you can see, is just a whole bunch of tools out there, technologies at various, levels of maturity and sophistication, and so on and so forth. So what's ending up to be is it's a chaotic bazaar of choices, right? And I'll be remiss to think that teams get to choose a set of tools and start with a fresh slate. That doesn't quite happen, right? That only happens in a startup like Launchable, where we get to choose this, but the next guy who we hire is going to land up with, existing culture and processes and tools, right? And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? See, what's happening in this world is, in this chaotic bazaar, you have these specialized shops selling their wares everywhere, and that's what makes a bazaar exciting, is this diversity. So one sort of best practice that we are, constantly seeing these days is this notion of centers of excellence and communities of practice. So what's happening these days is we are seeing the evolution of the central, developer tools team or the quality team, and it's actually becoming a community organizer. And they take these enlightened teams now have the responsibility of bringing, internal experts and sometimes external experts together to share best practices between each other, share what's working, what's not working, and sort of collectively push, the organization forward. Now, I think this practice, one recommendation from this talk would be is well worth emulating even for small organizations. So as an aside, we are often invited to these centers of excellence teams. If you want us to come in and talk about like where we think quality is heading, where we think, DevOps is heading, we would be happy to do that. And you can reach out on info@launchableinc.com if you need to set up, right? That pitch aside, what's happening is you've looked at the DevOps tool chain. The next piece in this has been around orchestration, right? So hat tip to sort of a previous company that I worked for. This is a slide we built at that point. The idea here is, and this phase is called DevOps toolchain orchestration, is to take the logical step of now sort of automating. Remember, DevOps is automation, collaboration, and agile, is automating this tool chain, right? And we, as sort of founders of Jenkins, we've sort of helped organization tie all these pieces together, bring automation to the software delivery lifecycle. And in the last 10 years, there has been a lot of focus around continuous integration, continuous delivery. Now, what ends up happening though is the orchestration is touted as the way to get you to the unicorn level delivery. But a lot of organizations mistake that for thinking that that's all they need to do, right? What you have at this point in time is a pipeline that gets you to a place to move faster, but you may or may not have moved fast enough, right? So the way to think about this is a fundamental piece, and I think of this as like a baby step to moving further in the DevOps world, right? So if we are, as you know, if you're an engineering leader, you're staring at this picture, you've connected various pieces, what are some of the bets that you can take to actually move fast, right? How do you move fast? And one lens to see is, what analysts are actually recommending. The DevOps field itself has become very mature, and so there's some recommendations here. So what I've done is, looked at one particular analyst and, looked at the Gartner hype cycle. And so the way I think about this is, they're talking about a troika of DevOps and culture, right? And this is from 2019. And I wanted to contrast, how things and how recommendations changed between 2019 to 2020, right? So on the culture side, uh, communities of practice upcoming, we've talked about it, so let's skip it. On the ops side of the house, you're starting to see, all the years of cloud and cloud management, discussions happening in the field. Seems like it is getting to a place where people are finally getting productive with it, right? And you should have been living under a rock if you've not heard about containers and container management in the last few years. I just came across a blog from a Hotstar SVP, wants to be a friend of mine, where they talked about, like, they moved to Kubernetes and they were able to pull off 2.5 times their previous load with 10x lower compute cost over EC2. So that's sort of the leverage that you get with moving to containers, right? What's more exciting to me is the dev side of the house, right? So we've talked about DevOps and DevOps toolchain, starting to think people are getting a sense, that point that I made, that just bringing these tools in is not going to make you move faster. So you've kind of gone from the peak of, inflated expectations down. But on the other side, you're starting to see a greater emphasis on quality with chaos engineering, and popularized by Netflix, and continuous quality sort of popping up on the radar. And so let's see sort of how this trend holds up as we move into 2020. So the some movement on the let's go culture. So communities of practice up there, moving up. On the ops side, you have container management and cloud management tools continuing on their journey forward. I think DevOps toolchain and toolchain orchestration are just sort of wrapped into one bubble right now, as opposed to just two separate ones. So let's keep that aside. Again, going back to the dev side, it just seems there's some very interesting things that are happening on this side. So continuous quality is picking up more than chaos engineering. The way I think about it is it's much more useful to actually make sure that the right stuff lands in the hands of customers versus worrying about breaking production to see what we can fix. So perhaps that's why there is emphasis there. And between that continuous quality and DevOps value stream, and there's a bit about hypothesis testing, it seems like there's a greater emphasis on figuring out, like, are we delivering the right quality, right? And are we delivering the right stuff, and are we delivering the right quality to our customers? And that's where I think the industry is moving. That's where DevOps is maturing to, right? It's like, let's figure out, are we shipping the right value, and are we shipping it at the right quality, right? Now, all this is great. This is where people want you to head towards. But when I still talk to, like, engineering leaders, the reality is something like this, right? People start on their, transformations. Here's an actual quote. Somebody telling me that we'll take about 3 to 6 months, put out, engineering there, but we don't quite know what the impact of the effort would be. So it almost seems like you're on this journey and you're on this long haul, and it has taken months, if not years, to drive transformation processes, but you have very little to show for a win. It just seems like a hard slog. And this is such a dismal view of the world. So it's kind of all lost. I think that's a thing a few folks think about. So one path forward, and I happened to see this blog in the last couple of days. It's pretty interesting. Is this recommendation is, like, as leaders, one of the things you should do is that you should standardize around processes or workflows. Or the right way, I think, is figuring out what are the key jobs to be done within the organization, and formalize the processes around it, and ensure that your tools can fit in those processes, right? And often these processes and workflows are defined by the fact that you're using the tools, but once you formalize this over a period of time, you can swap in and swap out some of these tools, right? So for example, if you're like 3 years ago, you were spinning up EC2 machines. Maybe 5 years ago, you were spinning up EC2 machines. 3 years ago, you were like spinning up Mesosphere to deploy services. Today, you're doing, with Kubernetes. And maybe 2 years down the line, you might be on serverless. The act of the tooling and the platform might change, but the act of deploying would remain the same. The job to be done would be the same. So if you standardize around that and you think about it, you can actually move in processes in and out, right? So I think that's one of the big takeaways that you can do as you go ahead. But that still kind of leaves you in this place where things are moving, but they're not moving fast enough, right? And often, people think of like, so one of the arguments that we are making, why we started this company in testing domain, is we realized that the biggest chunk that is eating into development engineering team's time was testing, right? When you talk to teams, they think of testing as a tax. And while we thought of this as sort of the veritable low-hanging fruit where teams can draw quick wins, right? So let's just take a moment, a few moments to think about what's happening in the quality landscape. So sure enough, here's sort of Gartner talking about it. They talk about sort of what are the key sort of controls that teams have within the DevOps landscape, and how they can manage these controls, right? And so they talk about these 5 key controls: testing, quality, sort of access control, activity logging, disaster recovery, and traceability. The way I think about it is like 3 of these: disaster recovery, traceability, and activity logging, are all sort of after the fact. It's like putting up the fence after something's gone wrong and ensuring that the next time things don't happen. And 2 of them, quality and access control, are preventative, right? And that's why I think quality sort of happens to be on the top of the pyramid in terms of the controls for organizations. This is where they can actually sort of control what gets in the hands of their customers. They can control the developer customer experience, and they can delight the customer with that, right? So if you go by this, one of the areas that you should focus on is quality. And if you actually double click on the quality field in the DevOps landscape, it's an overwhelming set of choices, right? The testing and quality landscape is vast enough. Sort of hat tip to Redpoint Ventures, who have sort of built this graphic. And so this is sort of there's a lot, large set of functional domains, and there's just a lot of companies out here that you need to work with. So if you are an engineering leader, you're looking at this and you're going like, man, not only I need to write more tests, I need to write more tests in each of these domains, right? So what we find is when we talk to engineering leaders, they're really they're overwhelmed. And they're overwhelmed on sort of 2 axes. One is this notion of, we just don't have enough tests, right? There's just not enough tests. We are not covered enough. Let me go back, write more tests and come back to you and talk to you. On the other side of the spectrum is this notion of like, man, we have so many tests and they're getting in the way. It's just hard to kind of sort of make progress, right? And then when you scratch the surface, you start finding that automation is not as widely spread as you would like it to be, right? So earlier on, we talked about automation as one of the key pillars in DevOps, right? And again, sort of citing Gartner, they talk about like only 26% of testing is completely manual, and only 34% is completely automated. So what we find is like automation is on the top of the minds of the organization, and that kind of holds up with the survey that Gartner did a few maybe a year back, where they called sort of automated testing as sort of the number 2 technology for DevOps transformation. So if you are, in this place where your tests are not automated, this is definitely a place to go. And they predict that by 2023, 75% of organizations will, in some form of or the other, sort of implement continuous quality practices, right? And this sort of meshes up with what they were predicting in their hype cycle. So what is continuous quality, and what does that mean, right? Uh, the the idea here is that unlike in the past, where quality was thought of a function that existed elsewhere, and you took your code and you threw it over the wall, it's much more a responsibility of everyone in the company, right? And so this implies that culture change, where you're actually bringing this conversation high up. The other one around this is the notion that it's part and parcel of the workflow of development. It's not an afterthought, right? It's part of the DevOps process. And though the underlying key sort of philosophy behind continuous quality is we should catch and sort of find risks and mitigate risks as early in the in the software life cycle as possible. So in that worldview, if you're able to do something like this, where quality is part of the culture, you're able to drive changes and detect risks early, fix them early before they land in the hands of the customers, you can delight these customers, right? Your engineers can have faster sort of feedback loops, right? And so that's sort of what the continuous quality culture implies. And sort of the two key recommendations, if you follow, folks are experts on the in analysts or elsewhere, you find that the recommendations are really, let's just automate tests, and you see that with the survey that I showed earlier, and start moving test left, right? The idea here is to combine sort of coding coding and testing in sort of one seamless activity, and just make that sort of this nice infinite loop that DevOps stands for. So if you look at sort of testing itself, shifting left is easier said than done, right? Why do we have this sort of this picture where the pink curve shows up, right? People don't start off by saying let's push our tests right. There's a reason why their tests have moved right. So it's because if you're a team, you start off with tests, you start adding more and more tests, and after a point it takes a while to get some feedback, and it slows your development team down. So you decide, well, let's just break it up and push them on the right because they are heavier tests, and over a period of time your tests kind of get push right. And as you push these tests right, what's implicitly happening is your risk to your system is being pushed to the right? And then you are in this place where you now have like few smoke tests suites and end-to-end integration tests. There are some that are running in production and so on, but essentially you've taken all the sort of risk and pushed them out on the right. And when you decide you want to move them left, you get to a place where you now need to figure out, like, should we sort of split these test harnesses down into smaller components? One answer is let's just parallelize them and spin them up on Amazon and we'll pay for it. Another one is, we've seen teams actually redoing their entire pipelines, going to Bazel, and it's like a multi-year journey for them, right? So it's not very cheap to kind of do that. Right. So that's one of the reasons why things don't move left. And when things don't move left, you encounter pains, your developers encounter pains, right? And so here's sort of us talking to folks in people that we've talked to in sort of the context of Launchable. I think of the challenges in like above the line and below the line. And so below the line is, notions around test automation. How do we improve our testing culture? What can we do to sort of make improvements on manual testing? UI testing sucks. How can we make that easier, and so on and so forth. But above the line is sort of the questions around developer happiness, right? We have slow tests, they take forever to run. The feedback, the dev cycle is very slow. Productivity is being hit down. And we were talking to this company, and which is a central DevOps team. It's a phenomenal team. It does a lot for their organization. And when we started talking, and they think that these sort of slow feedback loops impact the productivity of their engineering. And maybe the engineers are not maybe 10%, 10 to 15% productivity hit. When we went out and talked to the engineers on the team, what we heard was like they felt like their productivity is down like 20 to 50%, right? And they were quite angry. They were like, we see what the dev tools team is doing, but they're not doing things fast enough, right? So here we are as developers, we spend evenings kicking off runs and builds, and they don't get done. And then the feedback comes late in the night. I feed my kids and come back and make sure things are passing. It's just insane. We're just very, very angry, right? So that's sort of the world that people are living in, right? So with that, does sort of, let's look at the AI and the machine learning side of the house and see whether sort of this brings in some relief to people. So if we sort of, review the landscape on where the industry is heading, on the sort of y-axis, on the x-axis, you have, the software delivery life cycle. On the y-axis, what you have is sort of the maturing of services. So if we look at the last maybe, maybe 15 years or maybe more, what you see is sort of this gradual maturity of services where we went from like, craft implementations where, things were being crafted by individuals by hand and being built to sort of, going to like at scale, it's volume play, right? You have like the notions of GitHubs and Jenkins and Artifactory helping you scale things across your organization. And I think the next trend here is really heading towards, smart and, bringing in, making these tools smarter and much more automated and sort of, automated decision making, right? So that's sort of where I think tooling in general is headed towards. Now, one of the things that we see organizations do is to go figure out how to actually bring in, AI and machine learning, AI practices within the organization. And it's a hard job. And this is coming in from McKinsey. What it's sort of defining for you is like, it's a vast field. It's a very complex field. And you have to understand each of these fields to figure out what's applicable for you within your industry, right? So is this, headed towards decision trees or transfer learning, reinforcement learning, and these fields are fairly new. There's not enough expertise out there. The McKinseys of the world are trying to help organizations take macro level decisions. So for example, they are looking at all sorts of industries, and they're trying to sort of produce a heat map that talks about like which practices can be used in which organizations, right? And I just don't think this does enough, right? If you are sitting up, in the DevOps team at Bank of America, yeah, you have to think that perhaps you need to look at feed-forward networks and recurrent neural networks. It just doesn't work that way. And to sort of make matters worse, what's happening in the AI field is a whole lot of AI washing that's going on. And there's just some sort of interesting predictions that are just impractical. So if I was looking at like what are the predictions for QA for the quality field from industry experts, and you hear stuff like, let's go out and create like an AI QA strategist role that looks at like how do we bring in AI across the organization. It's unlikely to happen in medium to small size companies. Or there was another, like, let's drive investments in pure math skills and drive pure math skills in every sort of QA team out there. Not going to happen. Or like, let's get data scientists and embed them in every team. Given the scarcity of data scientists, I don't think that's going to happen. And the vision that's being painted is this sort of, interesting, interconnected, sort of intelligent analytics, each feeding into each other, which might be true like maybe 5 or 7 years down the line, but not today, right? So what you actually see is, quotes like these. It's like, hey, I have a problem. My tests are not running, whatever. And I'm not going to spend time learning machine learning and bringing my organization up into various machine learning skills before I see what's applicable. I just need to find a product to do this. And that's, I think, a good news, where there's been a number of startups in this space in the last couple of years, including ours. So the way I think about it is, the interesting thing that's happening in this field can be dropped into two sort of buckets. The first sort of addresses that one concern, which I talked about, which is, hey, we don't quite have enough tests, right? And so you have a number of, companies in there that are looking at this space. So you have Mesmer, who's doing sort of mobile web bots to generate tests. You have Test.ai, that is actually building sort of, it's a mobile cloud to test applications. You have Mabel, that's doing web test generations. Functionize, who's doing some NLP-based test generation, visual scripting. Appvons, I think, is doing something around Selenium. So there's just a number of things where people are coming in and using natural sort of computer vision, etc., to generate new tests. On the other side of the problem, which was like, we have lots of tests, there's not much happening. There's a lot happening in the unicorn companies like Facebook, Google's, and Shopify's, who've actually sort of put stuff out there that are using sort of machine learning practices, and they have papers published that talk about like, how do you sort of use machine learning to start optimizing tests. And that's where actually Launchable sort of comes in, right? One of the reasons why we started Launchable here is reminded us of our time in the early Jenkins world, where our co-founder Kosuke, when he created Jenkins, he saw that every organization out there was every big unicorn organization was trying to build their own CI server. And he could take that and actually build a scalable solution that cuts across, a vast, set of use cases and companies. And we feel like sort of machine learning and testing is at that place where we can actually look at these practices and build a generalizable solution. So that's where sort of Launchable comes in, right? So if you are an engineering leader who's looking at sort of improving your practices, you can look into these companies and see what they're doing actually to sort of bring some changes today, as opposed to, a few months or years from now, right? So where do we go from here? So one, on the DevOps side of the house, I think the key is to combine coding and quality into one practice, right? It's really about reducing churn and making sure you can delight your customers. So if you haven't automated your pipeline, please do so. If you haven't automated quality, please do so. If you have automated that, start looking at reducing, your risks to your tests. Try to shift tests left. And one sort of counter, thing here is you can also think about sort of bringing in tools that drive cultural changes, right? That drive, improvements in the process, as opposed to also, designing a process and trying to fill tools in. So sort of look for that balance, and drive those. On the AI side of the house, I think my strong recommendation would be is like the field's still nascent in terms of what needs to happen on DevOps and quality. So don't try to, unless you're the Googles of the world, don't try to build an in-house practice, right? The stack is expensive. People who are working on that is expensive. So just go in and explore sort of off-the-shelf tools. So that's one recommendation from me. So this is actually where we fit in, right? So we are this off-the-shelf tool. One of our core philosophies as we started sort of thinking about the company was going to that image where people are on this hard slog walking through the glacier. Was like, it takes too long for these efforts to show value to people. And there needs to happen something much faster. And that's why we started the company. So the company started by me and Kosuke, who's known as the creator of Jenkins. We've sort of built the DevOps business at a leading DevOps company called CloudBees. I was at Atlassian for a bit where I helped set up the DevOps strategy there. So we've been in this space for a while, but the company really got started because of this relentless question that keeps coming up to us, right? It's like, I have a small change. Why do I need to run all the tests, right? And so in that space, right, as we've talked to like companies, we see like these 4 or 5 key challenges, and that's what we're aiming to solve over the next couple of years. One of them is around slow test feedback. If you remember, it was one of the top sort of reasons why people were frustrated on the above the line graph. There's notion around flakiness of tests, right? Tests are just unreliable, and when people run them, there's not enough signals coming in there's not enough difference between signal and noise. What test to run, right? That's another key problem, right? An example is I'm shipping stuff to production tonight. I have like an hour to sort of make sure that dispatch goes through. What are the key tests that I need to run, right? Or the fact that some test broke. We have an organization of 1,000 people. Who should we reach out to go fix those issues, right? And how can we reduce QA infrastructure costs, right? So that's sort of where we come in. So if you have to actually place us back in this red point picture on where we are and where Launchable is at, I think that's an interesting question. The way we think about it is, if you were an engineering leader thinking about us, you're thinking of us sort of at a layer that's sitting above all these boxes, right? Whereas in every one of these, functional boxes, what you're doing is you're going in and building more and more tests. Where we come in is we actually go in and optimize our tests in each of these tiers. So we are applicable across, right? And so that's what makes us, special, right? So we can cut across, all that functional stack. We can cut across the types of applications. We can cut across types of languages because we are building a machine learning model underneath it. And I realize I haven't still talked to you on what we do. So let's just get in there, right? So one of the things that we deeply care about is this notion that of test feedback delay, right? So if you were a developer, you're working on a change and you push some changes in, the real valuable feedback comes to you when, a test fails, because that's the point you can actually take something and make progress. You can fix it, all right? In some scenarios, you may have like that coming to you in like minutes from unit tests, or, hours because you're running integration tests, or days if it's running something behind, right? So if we take the scenario of a nightly test, I checked something at 10 a.m. and my first feedback actually comes in at 2 a.m., which is useless to me. So I come back next morning and my day starts fairly shitty, looking at a problem and going and fixing it instead of doing what I wanted to do, right? So the key question that we asked ourselves is like, hey, if we could look at all these sets of tests, and if we can actually determine the probability of a failure of a change set, um, uh, how would sort of the developer workflow change, right? So the canonical example here is you have, say 1,000 tests, the 900 test failed. You've essentially run the first 899 and there's been no signal. The developer is waiting for it. You're burning AWS costs while you're doing that. Can we sort of change that? And the short answer is yes. So if you were able to, predict, what the probability of failure of a test based on change sets, you can sort of sort these tests in the order of like likelihood of failure. So now that 900 tests could be sorted and run first within the first minute. and the developer would get that feedback right away, and he or she can actually make progress from that point onwards. What tends to happen is if you do that, it opens up some very interesting workflows. One of them is around this notion of requires understanding the notion of adaptive subset, which is nothing but like, we can put a box around these prioritized sets. And one of the boxes can be around time, another can be on confidence, right? So on the time side of the house, we can say, hey, I have like 30 minutes, run all the pertinent tests in those 30 minutes, right? And we'll run those tests, right? And in that worldview, like let's just look at like one particular workflow that happens for a developer, right? And in this worldview, again, I talked about this earlier. You have like a test that runs. You checked in something at 10 a.m. She comes back. The test fails at 2 a.m. She comes back in the next morning and she sees the failure. So the feedback delay is about 16 and a half hours if she's sitting at her desk, right? And this is happening across the organization. So if you sort of cumulatively add up the costs of everybody in the organization, in this case, it's about 1,000 hours, right? And with what happens with Launchable is, and that adaptive subset in this case, is we can say, hey, let's run like 30-minute adaptive subset builds throughout the day, right? And these adaptive subsets are a snapshot on the midnight runs. And what's going to happen in this case is I checked in something at 9:59 a.m. and at 10 a.m., my changes were picked up and I got like a set of tests associated with my changes. And within the first 18 minutes, I got the feedback. So I no longer had to wait another 24 hours to get that feedback. So my, feedback time reduced from like 16 and a half hours to 18 minutes. And cumulatively, the wait time across the organization dropped from like 1,000 hours to sort of, to about 19 hours. And that's substantial sort of impact, right? So the last bit here is what we end up doing. We've talked to a number of, people who are working with us, and here's an example of, what we've been doing. And so one of them here is a car company, right? And in their case, right, is like, it takes them about 2 hours to run the test suites. About 65 minutes of them is a setup time, right? And this is sort of this media device in the car, on the car, and it's actually being run on hardware. People are waiting for this hardware. And, guess what? For them, that parallelization, let's parallelize tests on the cloud doesn't quite work because you cannot spin cars in the cloud. It's too expensive, right? So they don't quite have that path forward, right? It's a very expensive path. So in this case, what's happening if you were a developer, and the red line is the key one here. On the x-axis, you have the test times. On the y-axis, you have confidence, which is how quickly am I getting the confidence that, my build is going to go through or regressions are going to be found, right? So if you were sitting in that team, you push some changes, and around like, an hour 10 minutes, you've reached about 90% test, and that's the point you're going to say, ooh, likely, all the tests are going to pass and my changes are going to make its way through. There's a queue of people behind me trying to get to this hardware, right? And with Launchable, we were able to sort of find the same 90% confidence in about 76 minutes, and this includes the setup time, right? So essentially, we've dropped their sort of end-to-end cycle time from like 2 hours to an hour and 15, right? And so if you are this developer, once the setup has happened, very quickly you get to know whether your changes are going to go through, right? And that's just fantastic, right? And once you get that, you can just, get side and the next guy can come on there. And in their case, sort of by sort of freeing up this queue, we are able to actually triple their hardware capacity without actually buying any new hardware, right? So that's one of the key things that we've been able to do, right? Now, if you were this engineering leader who's sitting across the organization and seeing what's happening within your team, you probably see a graph like this, right? And in this graph, what you'd see is like, hey, the average waiting time in the organization is about 16 hours. And at some point, Launchable came in, it started learning about our systems and our tests. And then at some point, we said, Launchable, go start optimizing my test runs. And, boom, there's a cliff, at which point the feedback time just greatly reduces for the organization. Right? So that's what they will see. And the net impact of that is that by sort of freeing those resources, you start sort of seeing the number of commits. You remember we talked about like it takes 6 changes for one particular organization to get a change set through. They can get more changes in through the day, so they can get some more commits going in through the day, and over a period of time they'll see sort of developer productivity improving. Right. So that's sort of the bottom line that you bring to bring to the teams there. Right. And all of this is happening at sort of a push button sort of machine learning kind of thing. Right. So the last question, the last sort of takeaway that I'll leave you with, and I'll end the slides here, is really, if you have, when you walk back, one of the things you have to think about is if you had the power to select sort of an intelligent set of tests to run at any point in your workflow, like how would your workflow change, right? Would that make it better? Where would you change? And to just seed your thoughts in the example here, right? The workflow actually doesn't quite change for a developer. What the developer saw is her runs are just moving transparently faster. And what she's getting is feedback earlier. And over a period of time, I think that would unlock new sets of behaviors that the organization can look at. It might just be, let's take the time that's given back and write more tests and make it more robust, or build more features. So with that, I'll call this webinar done. So the key things I think I would want you to think about as you walk away is to think about sort of quality as this rocket fuel versus a tax to drive DevOps transformations, and then start sort of thinking about and looking at off-the-shelf AI ML tools to sort of turbocharge your quality. The net effect of that is going to be you'll get your DevOps transformation processes will move faster. Your developers are likely to be happier, and you're going to land sort of more quality stuff in the hands of your customer, and hopefully reducing churn. So with that, I'm going to pause and open up for questions.
Nothing at the moment, Harpreet.
All right. So with that, we'll call this done. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll send this out and put it on our website. Thank you very much.